Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Loren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Loren Richmond Jr. Today I'm welcoming Dennis Sanders to the show. A native of Flint, Michigan, Dennis is an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. He received his bachelor's in journalism from Michigan State University and his MDiv from Luther Seminary. He has been a communications professional working for various nonprofits for over 20 years. From 2008 until 2013, he was associate pastor at First Christian Church in Minneapolis. Since 2013, he's been the pastor of First Christian Church of St. Paul in Roseville, Minnesota. He lives in Minneapolis with his husband, Daniel. I should note for our listeners, this episode was recorded live from the General Assembly of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Louisville, Kentucky, so there will be a fair bit of background noise, but I think the content makes the conversation worth listening to. Hey, this is Future Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Loren Richmond Jr., and this is another special episode from the Disciples of Christ, Christian Church Disciples of Christ General Assembly in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm here with my podcast pal, Reverend Dennis Sanders, and we had the pleasure of meeting in person the first time, yesterday was it? So we're fast friends here. But Dennis, this is day 3, I think, of a General Assembly for the denomination, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, like I said, Louisville, Kentucky. I figure let's just talk through, what do you think, what's going on? What have you noticed so far? What is the overarching themes you're paying attention to?
One of the things, I had an interesting conversation this morning with pastor that I know, actually from Michigan.
Okay.
And he was it was interesting just kind of talking, and this is kind of reminiscent of another conversation earlier in this General Assembly, just about kind of the state of the denomination, especially in his region. A lot of churches have closed.
Yeah.
And just kind of wondering about what is the future.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something, for some reason, that just keeps coming to me and it's not to say that I think our future is dark or that we don't have a future or something. I'm not in that viewpoint, but I'm concerned about that because I see a lot of churches closing, and even where I'm from in Minnesota, we've seen churches close. So I guess the question I'm sometimes left with is what are we doing to kind of help produce sustainable communities, to help congregations that are, kind of holding on the best way they can, and also to plant new communities. And I think then that leads to a kind of a bigger issue that I'm concerned about at times is, do we still think that church, the local congregation matters? I want to get to that. For sure. Let's talk practically, because I know, and I'm not as dialed into the disciples world working in the UMC church. And I know there's some things at works in play in process here about towards the future of the denomination. Can you talk kind of about those and your understanding of that, and how do you think that's meant to kind of help bring about newness, freshness, or nimbleness, perhaps? Well, I think some of the updates to the design, which is basically our bylaws, are probably helpful. I was a little bit concerned because I was worried that they were going to be derailed early on, because there's a lot of talk about that none of this mentions specialized ministries. And knowing a lot of people who I know are in specialized ministries, I totally understand. Sometimes that people don't get that acknowledgement, but that is more of a regional matter. That's not, the matter of the whole church. And when you're dealing with the whole church, one of the things you're dealing with is congregations. So I think that this is trying to hopefully get more congregations involved in the process.
Mm-hmm.
I think more
laity involved.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that has been actually a bright point I've seen here, is I think I've seen more non-clergy folk here than I have in past years.
Yeah.
Where it seems to be much more clergy dominant.
So what are kind of the big nuts and bolts of that design change?
Well, I think some parts of that are things like, it used to be that you had to have churches could send people to General Assembly based on their size.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the lowest amount you could have is either like 2 or 3.
Okay.
And, so that meant that larger churches could send a huge amount of people.
Right.
And kind of, as someone once said that we're going from kind of like the House of Representatives to the Senate, so that it's basically
evenly diverse.
Everyone is there. And I think there's been some wanting to do that for equity's sake.
Yeah.
I think makes some sense.
Yeah, especially for, smaller churches, immigrant or
exactly.
churches.
Mm-hmm. And I think it also kind of gives some of the smaller churches a little bit more say.
Right.
So I think that is a good thing. And I think that's worthwhile to consider.
Now, how much conversation has there been around, I know the denomination has been undergoing this narrative project where they're really talking about narrative. How much have you seen of that around the denomination, around this conference?
I haven't really seen that much of it here.
Okay.
In fact, I've heard a little bit about the narrative project before General Assembly, but I have not heard anything here. So, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I am surprised about that. What are some other things you've noticed?
I think that there have been some, I don't know, it's been more, I think, diversity in some ways on some of the preaching, which I think has been good.
Yeah.
And sometimes in past years, it hasn't been as diverse. And what I mean by that is not necessarily racial or ethnic, but I think more in just the scope of perspectives.
Yeah.
And sometimes that has been really narrow.
Right.
So to have a little bit more wider perspective, I think, has made, the preaching especially much more fascinating and interesting.
Yeah. Now, it seems like, just practically speaking, like, they got a smaller space this year.
Yeah.
And I think, like, in my mind, having the room be, frankly, overflowing, I think has given it more invigorating vibe.
I think so.
You know? Yeah. My only regret, and this is just, again, talking, like last night, they had a moment of prayer time, and they're playing softly on the piano, I Surrender All. They're playing softly, It Is Well. And I noticed, like, I was singing, I don't know if you noticed, Dennis, we're sitting next to one another. And some of the congregation around me was singing it. I wanted a worship leader to just go up there and be like, I feel like the room was there, the spirit was there for us to just start singing that, leading in psalm. And I was just like, man, that would have been a moment just to go with it. Still, even without that, I thought that was a powerful moment.
I think so.
Even right there. Yeah. What else? What have you noticed?
Well, I was actually going to ask you a question.
Yeah.
And last night's worship service was different.
Yeah.
It actually included more kind of pop songs.
Right.
That we've all heard growing up high on the radio.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to get your opinion. What did you think about that? with songs from like Tina Turner.
Yeah.
And, Beyonce and
the singers are incredible.
Yeah, I agree.
Incredible. They sang The Man in the Mirror.
Mm-hmm.
Frankly, grew up so conservative and sheltered that I did not listen to these on the radio, but I've only heard them in time. I thought The Man in the Mirror, I thought that tracks. I personally didn't really understand what was the point of, Tina Turner is just simply the best. Other than that's a poppin' song, and the band and the singers did a freaking amazing job. So, I guess I'd say, like, I'm not the only intended audience in the worship space. So, I imagine it resonated with others.
Yeah, and I'm kind of taking that in. I don't know.
Sure.
It's not kind of like, oh my God, I have to walk out. But,
right.
But it was just kind of wondering.
Yeah. Maybe this is just, I kind of admitted to it here. Like, I would love to have just some congregational, heartfelt singing. I know the night before, they did a song in Spanish that I was like, I don't really know these words. I would have loved to hear the rendition in Spanish and then sing it in English. Again, I know I'm not the only intended audience as an English speaker. But I would have loved to just, because I felt the emotion and the power of those words, even the few I could pick out. And in the ones I kind of Googled, like, what does this mean? And I was like, when it was done, I was like, I want to sing that in English. So that was my thought.
Yeah. But I think, to answer kind of your question about what else have I kind of picked up?
Yeah.
Is I think that there are, I still think that there is still a lot of good in this denomination. I will say that at times I get frustrated and concerned because I think we're not as large as we once were.
Right.
And so I wonder, how do we renew ourselves? How do we, and how do we, I think in talking with some people, how do we welcome people who may not always have the same opinions on things? And so, and I don't know how do we figure that one out? I mean, and I don't know.
This is what's coming to mind for me. And again, putting this in context, so listeners don't care about this, but this is reality. I could not get to sleep last night to save my life. I know our new church ministry was hosting a live prayer session that I want to go to, but I didn't wake up till it already happened just because of my sleep issues. And I think, like, I know I told you this yesterday, Dennis, when I was sitting next to you, like during this prayer time, like I was praying for you and your ministry and for our collective ministry here as a whole. I was praying for revival. I shared with you yesterday at lunch, like this prayer thing is kind of new for me. And I shouldn't say new, it's been renewed, maybe the better way to say it, been renewed in my spirit. And that was one comment I heard during the message that I wish, this thing about thoughts and prayers, if you pick that up. And I was kind of like, can we have prayers? Like, I think that's a pretty good darn place to start.
Yeah, I hear it so much that I sometimes just have stopped trying to. And I get it. If you're praying and you don't want things to change, that's a problem.
Right.
But we still do need prayer.
Right.
And I think it would be nice to hear that more.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing I would love to hear more, and maybe this is just more of a pastor thing, is that we don't do as much talking about theology. What does all of this stuff mean? What does baptism mean? What does Jesus mean? What does a church mean? Especially that last one, because I sometimes worry that we don't know what church means.
Yeah.
And so, and that was something that I think we once had, but we don't have it anymore.
Right.
And that I feel like we just don't have that generation of leaders that can really think theologically, and then in turn help us as the rest of the church learn from that.
Yeah. So, Dennis, you said something and my brain's fuzzy from aforementioned the lack of sleep earlier that I said we want to come back to. What was that?
I want to say it was kind of talking about the fact that why is church important? Why does it matter? And I worry sometimes that we don't.
Yeah, that's what it was.
We don't really stress that it is. And sometimes we even give off the message that it isn't important.
Right.
And that we don't seem to care that a church closes. We say, well, that's that. And I think that churches matter, I think they've always mattered. I think they matter especially these days because people are longing for community in some way. And there are so few places where we do have community.
Yeah. Like, what do you think in our denomination? Again, for listeners, Dennis and I are coming as clergy ordained in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Dennis, I think I've told you this, and I think you would mirror this just in what way I know you, that, like, I say I don't bleed disciples of Christ read. Like, and I mean, like, cause like red is our branding color.
Mhm.
Like, I believe the gospel of Christ. I feel like I could say the same thing about you. Like, in our context, like, do you feel like, we're more like, do you feel like what you felt here is we're more passionate about like advancing the gospel of Jesus than advancing the denomination? And maybe not just what you've seen here, but, you know, what you've seen broadly speaking.
I don't feel that we're advancing the gospel.
Okay.
I'll be very blunt.
Yeah.
And that's hard to say. And I don't want to make it sound like everyone in the denominations, they're all bad people or something.
Right.
That's not
Right.
what I'm getting at. Because I think that we all at times don't advance the gospel, and
Mhm.
myself included. But I worry that we don't know or we don't see what the gospel is or what the good news of Jesus is.
Mhm.
And we both talked about and both have been fans of Andy Root.
Yeah.
And I don't think that we have that sense of transcendence, that there is this God
Right.
out there that's bigger than us, that is beyond us, and that is willing to work in ways that are outside of our reality. And so we don't have that. And so I think what sometimes is left is then kind of, in this case, in our situation, the language of politics.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where we get stuck.
Yeah.
But then the danger of that is that if our church is just left with that, and people can get what they can get by watching MSNBC,
Right.
they don't need to go to church. They don't need to get up on a Sunday morning
Yeah.
to come to a church.
I mean, Ryan Bird, who we talked about, who's been on Future Christian podcast, he's talked about, I mean, I think literally today I saw a thread from him about, or a Substack from him on Threads, talking about how, if I'm remembering correctly, basically, you're more likely to be formed in your political persuasion, not by your church attendance, but by your partisanship.
Exactly. Yeah.
And obviously, to some sense, that makes sense. And I guess I saw a similar statistic related to this, and it kind of speaks to our societal polarization, that one's thoughts about gun control is more likely to be shaped by your political persuasion rather than actually owning a gun, which is kind of shocking, frankly. And I guess it talks about our thoughts around faith formation, around discipleship. I mean, maybe this is too big a question here. I don't know, Dennis. Like, what do you think is discipleship, is faith formation in the mainline church? Like, what do you think it is? What do you think it should be?
What I think it is right now is really politics. We kind of make Jesus into the great community organizer.
Right.
And again, I'm probably going to get pilloried for
this is
saying
Dennis
right
Sanders. Dennis Sanders.
But what does it? And I think being discipled doesn't mean that politics doesn't fit in there. I think it does.
Yeah.
You know, but I think being discipled means kind of listening and following to what Jesus says, and seeking to try to follow that the best way you can. But also knowing that is going to be the hard road and going to be a tough road. And for that, you need community that can help guide you and can be with you when you fall short, because you are.
Right.
We all are. And that we can have those things available to us. But I think right now we don't have that.
Yeah.
And so what we have are if you do these certain things or certain beliefs,
right,
but then we don't necessarily have it backed up with people, community that comes together to help you. And that I think that discipleship is bigger than a political persuasion. It's bigger than, an affinity group. It's about people who gather, I think, at the communion table, and we come from different perspectives,
right,
but we're all willing to be challenged by Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think that that's also the big thing. I think discipleship is always going to be challenging.
Yeah.
And I think too much of what discipleship is right now isn't challenging. I think it already adheres to what we already believe.
Yeah. I mean, I guess maybe let me offer maybe a contrarian point of view here. Because there's certainly young people who have been vocal at this, that are this conference here, that we're not, I mean, the denomination, like, we're not, like, what am I trying to say? Like, we're not doing enough as a denomination. We're not speaking out enough, that we're not following the way of Jesus enough. So I don't know, maybe, am I just trying to say, like, it's a tough
road to hoe, I think. It's hard, but you're not going to always speak out on every issue.
Okay. And I guess that's a question, right?
Yeah.
And I guess,
I just came out of one issue, and I think it is an important issue to bring up, and that's and you can have debates on trans things, on, whether or not you want to do puberty blockers and all that stuff. And I have questions on that, but I do strongly believe, I don't think that these bills help. I think that they actually they don't help, and they don't help us deal with a really complex issue.
Right.
And it could also be very dangerous. So I do think that those are things, it's important to speak out on that.
Let me ask this maybe, because I was in the business session, and this is really nerdy for our perhaps denominational listeners, or, there was a business session on condemning Christian nationalism, which again, sort of a no-brainer.
I agree.
But also, like, someone I thought said something kind of in opposition, and I thought actually was fairly reasonable.
Ooh.
And she said, hey, like, shouldn't we be doing this in conversation? Ooh. And I thought, like, that was actually a pretty reasonable take, because I imagine you'd agree with this, Dennis. Like, no one, freaking cares that a denomination of 500,000 people or less is saying something against Christian nationalism, at least broadly speaking, societally. But B, like, hearts and minds are not changed by us making a statement. Like, we're not, no one is, like, in a disciples church, home church, being, like, influenced or frankly discipled by conservative right-wing, far-wing voices who's like, oh heck, the disciples denomination just condemned it. What am I doing? So I don't think it's the most, and maybe that's the nuance perhaps that I wish we can make more space for, and I don't know, programming for or training for, of, like, I don't know, is it, and I could be completely misguided here, Dennis, so push back if you disagree, but I feel like we've kind of made these statements like, yeah, we've done something.
I don't want to, it would be easy to say, don't just not do the statements, but I think that there is something to them, even if we're a denomination, small denomination, but I don't think that's enough.
Okay.
I don't think that you can simply, we've said something about Christian nationalism, or we said something about anti-trans stuff, and then think that we've done our work. I mean, I think that there is some part of dialogue in there.
Yeah.
And, how are we, because maybe the people that we know aren't in Christian or influenced by Christian nationalism, but we might know someone that is.
Right.
You might know someone that goes to maybe a more evangelical church that is dealing or have faced that, or you may have a relative that is deep into this.
Right.
So how do you engage that person without attacking them?
Yeah.
And I think that has to be, how do you talk to someone who may not totally get the whole trans issue in a way that's respects them, but also engages them?
Yeah.
And I think that we're not good at doing that.
And maybe that's you're putting better words to what I'm trying to get at, is that, like, I want to see more kind of space and maybe, frankly, humility.
Yeah.
For those who are on the quote unquote right side.
Yeah.
Of this issue, to be like, hey, I can see how someone would get sucked into that. I don't know. Am I being too like?
No, I think that you have a good point. I think that there is not enough.
I mean, I get it. I love being like, my team's right. You're stupid. I mean, I get that. I think
I've shared this before, but years ago, 30 years ago, when I was just in my 20s and still, and actually basically coming to terms with my own sexuality as being gay, is that there were lots of churches that would be voting on open and affirming.
Yeah.
And they were really hard votes. And one of the things I would always hear someone say after a vote or a decision like this is, now we have some healing to do.
Right.
That they need to reach out to those who are on the other side and just to try to, that there was something important. There was a sense of humility.
Right.
There was a sense that the wider body mattered.
Right.
That I don't hear anymore.
Yeah.
That has been replaced, I think, with a lot more, I don't know, maybe less humility, more, I don't know if it's arrogance, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's not the same spirit.
I mean, it speaks to like the culture of milieu we're in, of the individual is like is the preeminent kind of value. And it's like this, I have to be individually myself more than I have to be to the community.
Exactly.
And the obvious implication for that is church is not going to work. Like we can't be a community together. So yeah, I mean, that's a challenge. That's a challenge there.
Yeah, it is. It is.
So, I mean, let's talk positive here. Like, I kind of talked about like the worship service really jived me. Seeing people engaged has jived me. Like, what pumps you up that you're going to take home to your congregation from this?
I think that there are people who are there to support me and my ministry. I think I've always enjoyed going to the workshops.
Yeah.
Just because I think they are there to help provide some practical knowledge in some ways, but to know that there are things there to support you, that sometimes it's easy to forget that that's out there.
Yeah. Oh, you know what? And I'm sorry for our listeners for going back to this, but I was just remembering, Dennis, that story you shared about the healing. Are you willing to share you wrote a Substack about this, and you had another personal story you shared.
Yep.
Can you share that story?
I will. Definitely. Yeah, definitely. That story happened 30 years ago in the basement of a Baptist church in Washington, D.C. And it was this church, it's actually a well-known church, especially in Baptist circles, was going to hire associate minister to staff. And the associate minister was someone who, she had long been an advocate for LGBTQ people. Very dear woman, and and the church itself at this point was made up of both kind of, I would say, more liberal Baptists, but more evangelicals. And there was some concern, of course.
Right.
And I remember in the meeting that was there to kind of decide whether they would call her, one of the people who was, a person stood up, and it was another woman. And this woman was from a family, that very kind of evangelical family.
Yeah.
And you probably would have expected her what she was going to say.
Right.
But this woman was friends with who was going to be the associate pastor. They had been friends, even though they did not see eye to eye.
Yeah.
And so she was going to vote in favor of calling her to be an associate pastor, even though they disagreed on this issue.
Yeah.
They were friends.
Yeah.
And that was what I think bound them together and allowed her to be able to say, it was relationship.
Yeah.
But I don't think we have those relationships anymore.
Now, if I can push further, Dennis, I'm thinking of another story too you shared about an older gentleman coming to you. Are you willing to share that story?
That one was about 20 years ago, and I was in seminary and at the intern at a disciple church in the Twin Cities. And there was an elderly man there. He's probably at that point pushing 80.
Yeah.
And there was something that there was a voting on that concerned me.
Yeah.
And he was the only one that voted no. And he wanted to talk to me in private. And he talked to me, and he had said that he was really struggling because he knew that, again, that I was gay. And he really prayed about it and prayed, and he just couldn't get to the point where he could agree.
Yeah.
And he said this with tears forming in his eyes. And
That's
he
powerful,
was
I think.
quite sad about all of this. And I think today people may have not taken that or been dismissive about it, but I think it meant something to me.
Yeah.
It didn't immediately, but I think over a few days or so it did, because he really took this seriously. He didn't just back it on. He just didn't just believe what he believed, and he really wanted to bring this before God, and he just couldn't get to that point.
Yeah.
And that he felt it was important enough that he wanted me to know why he voted no.
Yeah.
Again, it was about a relationship.
Yeah.
And I always respected that from him.
I mean, I think what strikes me about those stories is a relationship, and this, in your first story, this idea that a singular issue or a couple maybe issues aren't deal breakers or aren't tests of fellowship. And I feel like we're in a cultural context where single issues or couple issues can be tests of fellowship, to use a churchy word. The other thing that strikes me about your story with the older gentleman is his kind of humility. And I wonder, I don't know, frankly, if I would have that humility, and compassion and love to go to someone who I disagree with it. First of all, to have the spiritual commitment to say, I'm going to pray about this, honestly pray about this for, I don't know what he committed, but it sounds like he committed some time and prayer to this. And then say with that humility, Dennis, I care about you, or person, I love you, I care about you, I respect you, I disagree with this. And it obviously, and again, this is a cultural touch point right here, Dennis. This was something core to who you are. I don't want to speak for you.
No, but you're right. And a lot of people would say that's a deal breaker.
Right.
That it's core to who I am, so how dare you, and maybe I'm just weird that way. I just don't.
Yeah.
One, I know who I am in Christ, so I'm not as worried about someone disagreeing with me, because I know who I am.
Yeah.
But also, it's important for me that person learn from me.
Yeah.
And how are they going to learn if I don't give them the space to kind of wrestle with
learning and change comes in relationship.
Yeah.
Well, let's do this. Do you have any questions for me? Since we're going to kind of tag team this, I think you're going to release this on your show. I want to dominate the conversation completely.
Well, I guess maybe a couple quick questions is, where do you see the denomination? Where do you see a future in it for you?
I mean, that's a great question. A couple of great questions. I mean, I think where I see the denomination is, I was just looking at the statistics. We have our statistical thingamajig called Alex, which is like the denominational statistics. I mean, some things are frankly pretty shocking, like the median. Now this is, mind you, 21, so COVID statistics. So put an asterisk by that. But 20 or 22, I think it was. The median attendance is 40 people.
Yep.
So that's interesting, concerning. Another thing that really caught me is we nearly have in our denomination equal amounts retired clergy as we have active congregational clergy. Now, I didn't see data on the average age of clergy, but I'm guessing if that is so close, it tells you we have, broadly speaking, an older clergy base. So, I mean, I think those numbers are concerning. I wonder, frankly, that's why I'm grateful to see this conversation around narrative. Like, can we, as a group together, come up with a compelling narrative about not just why the disciples matter? Because as we talked about earlier, I'm not like a dyed-in-the-wool, like, we gotta be the red chalice type thing. But why does what we're trying to proclaim matter? So I think if we can figure out why what we're proclaiming matters, again, I'm going to go back to the gospel. the message of why following Jesus, like, because I believe, like, following the way of Jesus, if we're really following the way of Jesus, like, these other things are going to fall into place, or they're going to start to, not maybe immediately, but they're going to come around, I believe. I could be wrong about that. That's what I believe right now. So that would be my hope. And I'm hopeful, like, this narrative project, we can come to start getting at least made within ourselves as members of these churches, like, the importance of telling our story, telling why the story of Jesus matters, telling why the way of following Jesus matters. And that can lead to some regrowth and rekindling and revitalization. I mean, for myself, I was just having, I'm not sure how this will play out for our listeners here, but I just recorded an interview with another pastor here talking about new church, you know, and a part of that conversation, I talked about bivocationality, kind of my context. And I think, you know, I think I've come to terms with I'm not going to have, I mean, I don't want to speak for certain, but I doubt I'm going to have another 20-year full-time career in the denomination. Now, I'd love to, frankly, but just for me, I don't think that's going to happen. So I'm hopeful. My passion is church. I was just having a conversation late last night with a pastor, and he said something like, you know, the calling is sort of like you want to do something else, but you can't. And that's kind of where I'm stuck. So, I mean, I hope to find ways to serve. I'd love if it could be within this denomination. But if it's not, it's not. And that's what I'm thinking right now anyway.
Okay. All right.
Anything else? Anything else for us?
That's it.
Well, we both went to the Louisville Slugger Museum. I'll give a shout out for the Louisville Chamber of Commerce, I guess. And the Louisville Slugger Museum is pretty fun.
It is.
Pretty fun. I have a little bat. Couple bats that I got. So Louisville Slugger Museum, check it out if you make your way to Louisville. But yeah, that's a wrap for us today. So again, Dennis, let's do this. I always do this. Let me leave you with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
And also with you, Loren. Also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Loren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.